A new study has reported the links between increased sweetener intake and cardiovascular disease. Does this mean we need to avoid sweeteners? Let's find out. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Mark Green here, the Diabetes Diet Guy, and today we're talking about a brand new study that's been published looking at the association between artificial sweetener intakes and cardiovascular disease incidence. Now, the study in question is a rather large study. It looked at over 100,000 people and tracked them between 2009 and 2021. Now, the good thing about this study is that they used food diaries to assess the intake of these participants. Often studies like this use dietary recall, where people are remembering what they eat. Whereas at several different time intervals, this study got people to write what they were having as they were having it, and then they analysed it later down the line. And as I said, the particular aim was to assess if the sweetener intake in people's diets had an association with cardiovascular disease. And the participants were split into three different categories. Based on these food diaries, we had non-consumers of artificial sweeteners, meaning they had no artificial sweetener in their diet. We had low consumers, which meant that they had below the mean average of the group of the 100,000 participants. So they were considered low consumers, and we had high consumers, which means they had above the mean intake, which translated into a daily intake of 100 mils of a diet soda drink or about 1 packet of sweetener. So actually quite small amounts. So what did the study find? So the main finding from the study was that those that had a high intake of artificial sweeteners increased their hazard ratio to 1.09. So just to explain this very briefly, so a hazard ratio is the increased risk of something occurring. So a hazard ratio of 1 means you're at no increased risk compared to the general population or the group that you're comparing against of something happening. So the further away you get from 1, the more likely something is to occur. So a hazard ratio of 2 means that incident or that event occurring is twice as likely. A hazard ratio of 3 means that it's 3 times as likely to occur. So as you can see, the hazard ratio is 1.09. So not a huge increase from the comparison group, but nonetheless, an increased risk nonetheless. Now, where hazard ratio falls down is it doesn't tell us the exact numbers in terms of how likely this is to occur, because to the general population, hazard ratios isn't normal talk. So what's the absolute risk? So the absolute risk is looking at the actual numbers. And what we found was that non-consumers had 314 cardiovascular events per 100,000 of the population, whereas the high consumer group had 346 events per 100,000. So in absolute terms, it meant that there were 32 extra incidents of cardiovascular events in the high consumer group. So we can see it's not a huge amount, but if you're in that 32, it's gonna suck. Delving a bit deeper, we can see the different types of sweeteners that had these increased risks. So we saw that aspartame had an increase of cerebrovascular disease. So to do with the brain, things like stroke is more than likely going to be these types of events. Whereas sulfame and sucralose had an increased risk in coronary heart disease. So what's our overall analysis? Well, I've written down some points here, so not to overwhelm the board. So just one key element about this study is that they use something called a Cox regression hazard ratio analysis. So what this does is it starts to separate out all the other factors that may affect these results. So for example, the high consumer group also had an increased risk of obesity, smoking, they had reduced physical activity, they had reduced fiber intake, they were more likely to follow a weight loss diet, they had an increase in red meat consumption, but they were also less likely to reduce alcohol. So the vast majority of those factors would also increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. So what a Cox regression analysis does is it starts to separate out those additional variables using mathematical models and assumptions to then start to see what the risk would be if we factored out all those individual constituents or variables that might increase the risk. Now, hopefully you can already see the problem with that. that despite the fact it can be a very clever mathematical model and might even be accurate, it's not actually the real life results that we saw necessarily, because there will be people that were smoking, that were overweight, that were having a reduced fiber intake, or weren't exercising, for example. So it's very hard in nutritional research to just focus on one variable. The way to do this ideally would be to have a group of people of the same age who need the same amount of calories, who follow the same diet, who ideally have around the same genetic susceptibility, although that would be very hard to test, and then you put them on exactly the same diet, and they also exercise the same amount, and then you manipulate the amount of sweetener that they're having. Now, of course, that's not practical and not going to happen in the real world, so we can't do that. So what we have to do is use these things called cohort studies, where we observe a group of people and then we work backwards and see which people are more likely to have a higher rate of certain diseases based on what based on their diet and what they're doing day to day in their lives. But the take home is, as a result of that, these types of studies aren't necessarily real world findings. We've had to manipulate the data to a certain extent to get to the conclusion that we have. Furthermore, and one thing to note, is that sweeteners also tend to replace sugar in the diet. And when you look at the data for sugar, for every portion of sugar that you have, for example, one meta-analysis found, and meta-analysis just being where they look at all the published studies that match their criteria at a certain point, and then they draw conclusions from all the studies that are published up to that date. And they found that for every increase in portion of sugar, there was an increase in CVD rates by about 8%. So actually, if you're replacing sugar for sweetener, are you any worse off? So I think the conclusion I take from this is there's probably no harm from sweeteners in small amounts. The low consumers didn't seem to have a huge increase in risk. And actually the absolute risk was only 32 extra people out of 100,000 in the high consumer risk. However, one thing that was quite significant for me was how much you actually need to be considered a high consumer. When you think about it, 100 mils of a diet soda pop isn't a huge amount. Actually, you consider that the average drink would be around 330 mils, or if you're having a bottle, it could be 500 mils quite easily. So obviously, if you're only having one a week, then on the average, you're not going to be in the high consumer category. But if you're having 2 or 3 of these a week, then you're going to be in the high category quite easily. And these are the sort of things you wouldn't even think of, or you wouldn't think much of it. So I think the key finding for me is that there isn't a huge increase in risk, but there possibly is a risk, and there might be something to this. Obviously, more data will need to be researched in order to start finding more conclusive evidence. I think really the take-home message for me is that moderation is key. Artificial sweeteners, in reality, if you're having them in excess, they're probably not going to be good for you. But if the alternative is a high intake of sugar, then they still are likely a good replacement. But of course, being a dietitian and thus relying on evidence-based to make my judgments, we'll see as time goes by as to whether or not more evidence can emerge and lead us a bit more in an informative matter about how we should be advising around artificial sweeteners. If you're worried, the advice would be probably best just to avoid them and try and kick that sweet tooth. And that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that video useful. If you did, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button so you can see videos when we publish them. If you want more information about managing diabetes or healthy living, head over to diabetesdietguide.com. More blogs, more information, all for free. And we also offer one-to-one consultancy services to work with you one-to-one to get the best out of your healthy living regime or get on top of those tricky glucose levels. You'll also gain access to our premium content and hopefully get you to a point where you no longer need us so you can become the expert. Anyway, we'll leave it there and we'll see you in the next video.